Hi all, welcome to today's webinar on 5-day test prep brought to you by the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University. I'm Betsy Malarczyk and I'm a learning skills specialist with the ARC. So you may be wondering, why are we talking about preparing for exams over 5 days? What's more important is to think of increasing your current study schedule from 1 or 2 days, more so than shrinking a study schedule from 6, 7, or 8 days. It's helpful to prepare for an exam over a longer period of days because you're testing your ability to recall information over a longer period of time. You need to trust that you have learned the material while you've been in class, while you've been doing homework. The information is in your brain. So the goal of studying for your exam is not to reteach yourself the information. It is to strengthen the neural connections that relates your brain to specific facts and ideas. So by giving yourself an opportunity to check in with study materials over several days, then you are giving yourself the opportunity to test how strong those connections are and how accurately you can remember. You can certainly have a longer study period. 5 days, we often talk about as a reasonable span of time for preparing for an exam, only because as Georgetown students, you're so busy that you probably have something else popping up 5 days before your exam. You want to consider spaced practice and spaced study as you might consider training for a marathon. So if you were to run 26 miles, that's a plan. You certainly wouldn't show up to run those 26 miles without having practiced at all for the month beforehand. But you also wouldn't practice running for 8 hours the day before the marathon and then show up expecting to run perfectly without any prior practice. That's because you've worn yourself out. And yet that's what students do all the time with studying. By cramming, by trying to get all of that information stored in one day, the night before, you're wearing yourself out. And so to a certain extent, you're doing yourself a disservice by putting so much pressure on the day before. If you can have those study sessions be briefer and in more regular, occasional intervals, then you'll be better prepared for the exam itself. This also, having your test practice period be over a period of about a week, also allows you to make use of spaced repetition. This is a study technique in which you allow enough time between study sessions that you begin to forget the material. So you may, on day 1, look at certain facts and then take a break and check back in with that material on day 3 to see how well can you recall the information when you haven't just looked at it. This goes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, in that what you're really doing when you're studying is testing your ability to recall information. So you can test that recall better if you include a certain amount of time for you to forget it in between different study blocks. Having your studying spaced off across multiple days also allows you to make use of the 24-hour rule. So what the 24-hour rule tells us is that if you see and think about a piece of information within 24 to 48 hours after learning it, your brain decides it's important and is more likely to remember it. This is a reason why so many students tend to review notes after class or the next day after class. Because if you're in class, you learn information, and then within 24 hours, you see that information again, your brain's now seen it twice, and it processes it as important. So let's say you haven't been looking at your notes, you're reviewing information for this exam, and you learned it, but you don't know if it's stored in there. By setting up your study sessions over a period of days, this allows you to look at the same information within 24 to 48 hours, even the week beforehand. So it allows you to make use of the way that our brains work to store information. One question that students often have is, how long should I be studying for? How long should each study block last? There's no rule for this because your schedule might look different depending on what kind of classes you're taking. And some studying might require more work if there's a lot of memorization. What is helpful to keep in mind, though, is that the quality of your study time is more important than the quantity of your study time. Sitting down to study for 8 hours, 5 days before an exam won't necessarily be helpful unless you have very specific goals that are different and varied throughout each of those days. It's much better to have more short, focused study blocks than it is long and exhausting. So if you can even make sure you're studying for an hour a day or 2 hours a day, that's going to be more helpful if you have clear goals for that study block than just an 8-hour study period would be. So let's talk about creating a study block. As I've mentioned, you want to make sure you set a specific goal for the time available. That means that when you sit down for a study block, you know what it is you are going to be doing during that time. So for example, maybe you are going to read over your notes for chapter 4. That is your goal. Then you work on that. Once you've completed your goal, set a new goal. If you've read through your notes on chapter 4, do you want to read your notes for chapter 5? Or do you want to go look up terms from chapter 4 that you have questions about? Either way, as soon as you finish one specific goal, be sure to tell yourself what the next one is to make sure that study block remains focused. When your study block is over, look over your study plan, updating it based on the progress that you've made. So be sure to, at the end of any study block, check in with your overall goals, that we're going to be talking about how to create those goals based on this 5-day test prep plan. And before you leave your study space, make sure that you have scheduled your next study block. You never want to walk away from a study block without knowing what you're going to be studying next and when you're going to be studying next. So when you sit down for the next day's study block, you should already have that specific goal in mind that you want to use to help guide you. Having those blocks pre-planned makes it easier to sit down and focus and makes it more routine to participate in the study process. So what is your study goal? This is essentially your plan for the study session. More specifically, it is a specific task that you can accomplish in a set amount of time. So if you're studying for 2 hours, you may have one goal for that whole block, or you may have a series of shorter goals, but you want to do the best you can to match the goals to the time you have allotted. So an example of an unclear goal might be, do practice problems. This isn't a great goal because it's indefinite, It could go on infinitely. We don't know how many problems you need to do to work on practicing the material or how long this should take. A more specific version of that goal is to review one practice problem from each chapter for 10 in total. This means we have a survey of all 10 chapters for this hypothetical exam, and we know what we're doing with our specific time block. We know there will be 10 problems we're working towards, and that helps us manage our time better. So moving into the purposes of your 5 study days, we're going to start with study day 1, where the main goal is getting organized. That's right, before you can even sit down to study, you need to focus on figuring out your study plan. The first piece for getting organized is to schedule your study blocks across the next 4 days. Look at your calendar, get a sense of when you're going to be sitting down to work and how long you'll be working for. Doing this, the scheduling piece early on, will help you figure out how many of your resources you realistically have time to go through. Plans are often most likely to fail because they're so ambitious that they're not realistic. So work to make your plan a realistic one. If you are a busy person, you have a lot of club activities, you have a part-time job, then maybe consider doing this step 6 or 7 days before your exam. That way you can give yourself a break if you know there's one day that you just won't have time to study. This could be especially useful if you have evening classes one day or a long shift at work. Once you've looked at your study blocks and scheduled those, familiarize yourself with the test format by looking over the syllabus, Canvas page, or past assessments. You may have very clear information about what's going to be on your test. Some professors even hand out study guides. If you don't, make sure that you are looking around at the information provided to you. Again, many syllabi have information about test format. Canvas pages may have practice problems. And if nothing else, you can get a sense of the test format by looking at your old tests and quizzes. Looking over your old tests and quizzes can also help you assess what mistakes you've made in the past. Looking for trends, either in question style or information, can help you come up with your study plan for the next assessment. So for example, if you did well on multiple choice but poor on an essay portion, why is it that you didn't do so well on the essay? And what can you do in preparing for this next exam to help make yourself more prepared? When you're getting organized, you should make a list of your potential study materials and prioritize the ones that will be the most helpful. Often when I'm sitting down with students, I recommend they list out everything that they have to study from. This includes professor-generated materials such as lecture slides, study guides, texts for the class such as textbooks, PDFs, and even materials that you've generated such as your own notes and homework assignments. You don't have time to go through everything, so try to choose which of these materials are both going to help you the most and are going to relate the most to the material on the exam. Once you've looked at your study materials and prioritized which ones you want to focus on, develop specific study goals for subsequent test prep blocks. This means that if you've decided to rewatch 10 lectures and read over your notes, you need to figure out which study blocks you're going to focus on the lectures and how many lectures you can do during that time, and which ones you are going to spend looking over notes. It's essentially playing a matching game between your study blocks and your study materials. If you have more study materials than you do study blocks, then you have two choices. You can either spend more time studying or cull away some of those study materials you want to review. I would recommend being mindful of not overextending yourself with studying though. Most often I see students give up on sleep to make time for studying, and this is not going to help you with the exam as much as getting a good night's sleep would. And then on this first study day, also keep track of any questions that arise either about the test materials or even the test format. If you have absolutely no information about your test format, then email your professor or look up when their office hours are. Getting organized is a great first step because then it allows you to figure out if there are any gaps in your knowledge that you need to have addressed sooner rather than later. So after your first day of getting organized comes study day 2. The goal with study day 2 is to look over the most difficult material. So why do we begin by looking at the most difficult material for any specific class? One reason is that this will give you more time to practice recall with the information that you're less familiar with. We've been talking about how studying for an exam is testing your ability to recall the information. By looking at the most difficult material on study day 2, you will have multiple opportunities to test that recall, specifically on study days 4 and 5, and you'll be able to challenge yourself more by having a gap between study day 2 and study day 4. Starting with the most difficult material also prevents you from pouring all of your studying energy into information that you're more familiar with. Sometimes we don't judge accurately how long it will take us to spend looking over material. So if you accidentally spend too much time on a certain subject, it would be better if it's something that you find more difficult and that you needed to invest that time into anyway. And then, as I mentioned before, this also provides you with enough time to reach out if you have any questions if something is unclear. If there's one topic you're looking over and you simply cannot make sense of it, then you still have time to send an email to your professor, stop by office hours, or even reach out to a TA or a classmate. Study day 3 is when you will focus on the less difficult material. When you are looking at the less difficult material, don't try to cover everything that you've covered in class. Instead, try to focus on the material that's most likely to be on the exam. One of the reasons that sitting down and figuring out your specific study goals as a first step can be so helpful is that it forces you to choose between what material you may not have a chance to look over. You have a limited amount of time, and 5 days before an exam, you simply cannot relearn all the material perfectly. If you think about how long you've invested into one class at this point in the semester, it's hours of homework, hours of visiting class, and there's just no way to replicate that experience as part of the test prep. So instead, you need to prioritize. Some students have trouble choosing what to study on day 2 versus day 3 because all of the material seems equally difficult. So if you have difficulty figuring out what to do on day 2 versus what to focus on day 3, think of it instead as using day 2 to review the material that will take the most time, or to review the material that seems the most important to the assessment. And then use day 3 to go over less critical, less time-consuming material. Day 2 should be a more intensive study day than day 3, just based on the material. So more versus less difficult might not be the most logical way for you to frame it. You may prefer to think of it as more important to the course and the exam versus less important. Study day 4 will be your day for intensive review. Study day 4, this is 2 days before your exam. The goal for this day should be to look over all of your pertinent study materials from beginning to end in a way that's practical and helpful. You should plan on putting the most effort into studying on this day. You're essentially looking at all the topics, not for the first time, but you're reviewing everything. Related to that, you shouldn't be looking at any material for the first time on this day. Sometimes there may be a concept that you skipped over, you missed, you feel like you didn't really understand, and you think that you need to relearn it as part of the study process. That is a task for, in particular, study day 2 or study day 3. Any learning, though, needs to have happened before study day 4. If you haven't learned it by this point in the study process, then spending significant time on learning it won't necessarily guarantee your success in the exam, whereas you will be more likely to succeed on your assessment if you spend this day doing a review of all the materials you have already learned. Focus on intensive practice during this day. So if you've already looked over information, you feel like you've been reviewing, consider using this day to practice as best you can. This is a great day if you have practice tests to work those into your study block. And if you do have practice tests, be sure to give yourself extra time to review those tests or problems. Study day 5 is final review, and this is our last study day. This is the day before the exam. As I mentioned with study day 4, on study day 5, you don't want to look at any material for the first time. Again, you are reviewing now. You should have already learned this material, and trying to learn it now the day before the exam won't necessarily help you as much as review will. Something to keep in mind on study day 5 is to focus on preparing your body as well as your mind. This can help diminish test anxiety. One of the most important exam tips I can give is to prioritize sleep. In a perfect world, all students, all people would get enough sleep every single night, and that's difficult to maintain, especially in a hectic university environment. But think of getting a good night's sleep the night before an exam part of your study routine. There are a few reasons why this is important. One is that you process information while you sleep. So if you're getting enough sleep throughout this 5-day prep session, then you are more likely to retain and process everything you've been going over. But then you will also perform better on the exam if you're well rested, because your body won't be stressed. And if your body isn't stressed, your mind is less likely to be stressed. Other things to keep in mind are to limit caffeine the day before, and the day before and day of an exam, try to eat a healthy, nutritious, balanced selection of foods. Again, our minds and bodies are connected, and sometimes if we don't take care of our bodies, that stress can alter our mind. So keep that in mind as part of your test preparation. A few suggestions for how to review on this final study day. One is to write out questions that might be on the exam. That can help you reframe the information that you've been looking at. Consider looking over old exams again if you haven't already. Some professors allow a cheat sheet. Doing that on this day could be a really good final review process, and it also will give you a better sense of what you might not have a handle on. The day before, though, should not be the most intensive day. As I mentioned before, that's study day 4. On this day, it should just be a general review, and you should, again, be prioritizing sleep. That's part of why cramming is not frequently beneficial to the test taking experience. Not only are you not storing the information long term because you're learning it one day and then regurgitating it the next, but you're also putting so much stress on your body. So we'll have time for questions in a minute. I wanted to mention, though, our next webinar will be Wednesday, November 19th, getting your study schedule back on track. So this is a great session to stop by if you feel like you're behind, if you have deadlines that are slipping by you, or if you just need a mental reset. So again, that'll be in mid-November. And if you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time today and have a great afternoon.